We will continue our discussion of communication theory with Edward Safire's linguistic relativity theory. This theory explains the relationship between thought and language. It simply states that the structure of a language determines the habits of thought and behavior in a given culture. It is not the culture that organizes the world or life in a given community, but their language. According to this hypothesis, how you think and how you communicate is a function of the structure of the language you speak. This means the interpretation that is possible in so many ways is predetermined by the language available. This is why the world is experienced and conceived differently in different language communities, and why those communities essentially live in different realities. Theories that explore the relationship between gender and language use are good examples of how this works in real life. The language and gender theory, for example, explores how the ways a given language determine how we experience the world, and how the power relations are embedded in the linguistic system of a given culture. According to this theory, English is a man-made language because it embodies the perspectives of masculine more than feminine. Within this linguistic system, men are the standard. For example, many occupational terms represent men as the standard and females as aberrant category, like waiter versus waitress and actor versus actress. Because our linguistic system is primarily masculine, it reinforces masculine ways of thinking and expressing ourselves. It robs women of their power of creating their own feminine linguistic conventions and feminine ways of expressing themselves. This silences the female voice, and it leads to the inability of women to express themselves eloquently in the male idiom. Social construction investigates how human knowledge is constructed through social interactions. According to this theory, what something is or what it means is established by the language used to describe that thing. Meanings are not found in things in the world or within each individual. Rather, meanings emerge through interactions with others. Language, then, is crucial because it's the system through which reality is constructed. To put it another way, the nature of the world is less significant than the language used to describe, discuss, and orient to it. According to this theory, each group, community, and culture develop its own understanding of the world. A thing does not really exist until it is conceptualized and defined as something by the social community. As the meaning for something becomes entrenched, it feels like an objective fact. It feels like that thing exists in the world apart from the communication that originally created it. These constructions are taken for granted, and it is assumed that this is the way the world is. Think about the meaning of crying in feminine and masculine cultures. It is okay to cry in feminine culture. It constructs it as a way of expressing feelings, but it is not okay to cry in masculine culture. It constructs it as a sign of weakness. The term constructivism is coined by Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Piaget studied how a person's ways of knowing developed through childhood. Later on, communication discipline borrowed the idea of constructivism from him. Constructivism explains that we interpret and act according to our mind's conceptual categories or knowledge structures. These structures and categories develop over time as we grow up and experience many things. So the reality does not present itself in raw form, but it is filtered through a person's own way of seeing things. So the key in constructivism is to understand and unlock these subjective ways of seeing, understanding, interpreting, and attributing meaning to the things. Interpretive categories we use develop over time as we grow up. Young children have simple construct systems. Most adults, on the other hand, have much more sophisticated ones. When you were young, for example, you may have placed all people into two categories, like big and little, nice and not so nice, right? Now, on the other hand, you have an immense number of constructs and categories to distinguish among different people. Similarly, different parts of your construct systems may vary in complexity. You may have elaborate thoughts about music, but simple ideas about international relations or math. Cognitive complexity is the central tenet of constructivism. The complexity or simplicity in our thinking is determined by the number of constructs and the degree of distinction between those constructs. The number of constructs available to you on a particular topic is called cognitive differentiation. People with high cognitive sophistication can make more nuanced distinctions among things than the people with lower cognitive sophistication. For example, many of us ask for help from an accountant while filing our taxes every year because we lack the cognitive complexity in terms of tax law to prepare our taxes easily without the assistance of an expert. When it comes to message design, the constructivist theory has given communication scholars a lot to think about. This theory has especially been useful in persuasion research. For example, now we know that someone with less complex cognitive system will design and use simpler messages. These messages will have only one goal. A slightly more cognitively complex individual, on the other hand, will design messages that have separate goals and deal with each in turn. And the most complex thinkers will create messages that integrate several goals in one message. So far, we have talked about cognitive structures affecting our thinking and language use. Now we're going to switch our focus to the speech itself. Speech act theory is the first theory we're going to look at in this category. Speech act theory explains how we accomplish things with words. This theory sees speech as an expression of intention. It focuses on what it takes to make a successful statement and to have an intention understood. When we communicate, we convey an intention, and we expect the other person to recognize that intention. If you say, "I'll see you on Monday," you assume that the other person knows the meaning of the words. But knowing the word is not enough. Knowing what you intend to accomplish by using the word is equally important. When you speak, you accomplish one or more of these four things. First, you produce an utterance, a simple pronunciation of the words in a sentence. Second, you assert your position. We call this, in this theory, a propositional act. Third, you communicate an intention, which is called an illocutionary act. Your primary concern when you communicate is that the listener understands the intention behind your words. It could be a promise, it could be an invitation, it could be a request, whatever it is, you hope that your listener will understand the intention behind your words. Finally, there is a perlocutionary act, which is designed to have an actual effect on the other person's behavior. A perlocution is an act in which the speaker expects the listener not only understand the intention behind the words, but also act on them. If you say, "I'm hungry," with the intention of having your friend understand that you would like to go and have lunch together, you are performing a perlocutionary act. Your friend comes with you and you have lunch together. The act is completed. So when we use this theory in research, we begin our analysis by separating the speech act into its four components as utterance, preposition, illocution, and perlocution. Then we examine illocution and perlocution separately. While analyzing the illocutionary act, we separate it into its components as assertive, directives, commissives, expressives, and declarations. Then we examine the perlocutionary act. A speech must meet a set of constitutive rules in order to be considered a perlocutionary act. So we look to see if actually the statement meets those rules. We call these rules propositional content rule. It looks at the content, and regulative rules. It looks at the intention behind the words. And then we simply ask ourselves whether these rules are met and how, and make a judgment about it. Coordinated management of meaning theory is used to examine how complex meanings and actions are coordinated in social interactions. According to this theory, when we encounter a communication situation, we do two things. First, we assign a meaning to the situation, behavior, or the message. Second, we decide how to respond to it or act within that situation. According to this theory, your meanings are closely connected to your actions. Meaning affects action, and action affects meanings. The example our book gives is actually a good one. If you think the performance review that you receive from your boss is an aggressive act, your response will follow logically. If you think she was trying to help you, your response will be different. Although this theory suggests that meanings affect action and actions affects meanings, it also tells us that there never is a one-to-one relationship between meaning and action. Instead, the connection between the two is mediated by a series of contexts. The context is the reference point that frames your meaning and action. Furthermore, these contexts are related to one another. They are a part of hierarchy. There is a hierarchy between them, and any given context is a part of a larger one. This theory teaches us that as we change the context, we change the messages, and we change the meanings attributed to them. The second concept that is important in this theory is coordination. When we enter an interaction with another person, we can never be certain what rules, expectations, or contexts the other participant will be using while they are trying to interpret our messages, understand them, and react to them. So the primary task in all communication is to first achieve and then sustain some form of coordination. Coordination involves organizing interpersonal actions so that we feel we are proceeding in a logical and appropriate way while we're communicating with others. Both parties involved in the communication process do not need to interpret the event or the messages in exactly the same way, but they do need to feel that what's happening is making sense given their respective rule systems, expectations, and contexts. So if you're using this theory to examine a social interaction, you simply examine the ways that individuals coordinate their meanings and actions during an interaction. What do they say? How do they react? And what factors determine the meanings that they attribute to this interaction are the basic questions you will be asking in your research. The next is the theory of identification from Kenneth Burke. Burke begins his theory of identification by distinguishing between action and motion. According to him, motions are non-purposeful behaviors. Actions, on the other hand, are purposeful and voluntary behaviors. Objects and animals have only motions, but humans have action, which means only humans can act in purposeful ways in communication and use and misuse the symbols. Burke explains how language functions as the vehicle for action and promotes either identification or separation. When symbols bring people together into a common way of understanding, identification occurs. The opposite division happens when symbols promote different ways of understanding and separate people into separate categories and groups by emphasizing the difference. Identification simply means recognizing that the other person and you have a substance in common. Burke calls this consubstantiality. According to him, identification occurs in 4 levels. First is material identification. It happens when you identify with someone simply because you and the other person own similar things, like owning the same brand of cars or clothes or living in the same neighborhood. Idealistic identification, on the other hand, is an identification based on shared ideas, attitudes, feelings, and values, such as being a member of the same church or a political party. Formal identification is the third form of identification, and it's about recognizing the form, arrangement, or organization of something and identifying that thing by that form. For example, looking at a poem and recognizing that it is a poem because of its form, or identifying with another employee because you both are working at the same organization. If identification occurs despite the fact that two people have very little in common, Burke calls this type of an identification as identification through mystification. Identifying with celebrities or politicians is a good example of how this works. Burke sees identification as the ultimate form of persuasion because it can motivate individuals to think and act in specific ways. The message design logic theory is simpler theory. The term message design logic describes the thought process behind the messages we create. According to this theory, there are a variety of ways to approach messages, and each person employ different types of logic in deciding what to say to another person depending on the situation. According to this theory, there are 3 types of thinking in message design: expressive logic, conventional logic, and rhetorical logic. While we are communicating feelings and thoughts, we use what this theory calls an expressive logic. Expressive logic is self-centered rather than receiver-centered. Messages constructed in this mode are open and reactive in nature. The sender gives little or no attention to the needs and desires or the feelings of the receivers of these messages. Conventional logic sees communication as a game to be played by following certain rules. Here, communication is a means of self-expression, but it proceeds according to some accepted and well-known rules and norms. A person operating within this logical framework aims to design messages that are polite, appropriate, and based on the rules that everyone is supposed to know. The third form of logic is rhetorical logic. Rhetorical logic sees communication as a way of changing the rules through negotiation. Messages designed with this logic tend to be flexible, insightful, and person-centered. They tend to reframe the situation so that various goals, such as persuasion and politeness, are integrated into a seamless whole. If a researcher is using this theory in their research, they would simply examine what type of logic is used in a given communicative act and the message that this logic formulated. Another simpler but widely used theory we will talk about today is compliance gaining theory. Compliance gaining theory attempts to explain how we get other people to do what we want them to do, or how we get them stop doing something that we do not want them to keep doing. Think about a doctor who's trying to convince his or her patient to stop smoking. You will have an understanding of a type of situation that this theory addresses. Researchers isolated many strategies that are used in gaining compliance of other people, but we simply categorize these strategies into 5 basic categories, like rewarding, punishing, expertise, interpersonal commitments, and personal commitments. The theory of goals, plans, and actions can be considered an offspring of compliance gaining theory. This theory identifies and explains the cognitive processes involved in compliance gaining. We may seek the compliance of another person for several reasons, which means we may have different goals. This theory regards the desire to gain compliance as a primary goal, and it tells us that the primary goal influences the compliance gaining strategies the person may employ. However, there are secondary goals, such as identity goals, conversation management goals, relational goals, personal goals, or emotional goals. This theory calls them the secondary goals, and it stipulates that these secondary goals can also have an influence on the choice of compliance gaining. So a scholar or researcher who's using this theory simply will explore what those goals are and how, based on those goals, a communicator is designing his or her compliance strategies. The politeness theory suggests that politeness is a universal value. Different cultures may have different levels of required politeness and different ways of being polite, but all people have face needs, which means the need to be appreciated and protected. So politeness is often the underlying goal of all interaction, all human interaction. According to this theory, in everyday life, we design messages that first protect our faces, then achieve some other goals. According to this theory, there are positive face needs and negative face needs. Positive face is the desire to be appreciated, approved, to be liked and honored by others. So the positive politeness is designed to meet these needs, make us more likable, honorable, appreciated. Negative face, on the other hand, is the desire to be free from all imposition and intrusion. So the negative politeness is designed to protect the other person when their desire to be free from imposition is threatened. Acknowledging like we are imposing when we are making a request from someone is a common example of managing negative face. Saying something like, "I'm sorry to bother you, but could you please tell me where the post office is a good example of this negative politeness. Politeness is especially important when we must threaten the face of another person, which happens, frequently in our daily interactions with others. Face-threatening acts occur whenever we act in a way that may fail to meet the positive or negative face needs of another person. Face-threatening is normal. There is nothing wrong with it. It is not a problem in and of itself, but it requires careful handling so we can avoid unwanted consequences. A variety of factors influence whether we deliver a face-threatening act or not, how we do so, and what forms of politeness is required to avoid unwanted consequences. So this theory provides a rationale for our research when we want to determine what those factors are in a given situation and how they influence communication and its outcomes. Soya Foss and Cindy Griffin coined the phrase invitational rhetoric in their essay, Beyond Persuasion, a proposal for invitational rhetoric. Not all forms of communication has persuasive goals, they argued in their essay. They see persuasion as a kind of violence because it implicitly or explicitly says to the other person, my perspective is right and yours is wrong, and you need to accept my view. So they set out to propose a different mode of interaction in this essay, and they called this mode of interaction invitational rhetoric. Invitational rhetoric uses the idea of an invitation both literally and metaphorically. When you use an invitation for others to consider your perspective, you invite your audience to see the world as you do and adopt your perspective. It is up to the audience, however, to decide whether to adopt that perspective or not. The primary goal in this type of interaction is clarification of ideas among all participants. In the traditional approach to persuasion, the audience members are expected to change in the direction advocated by the speaker. In invitational rhetoric, however, the speaker can also choose to change as a result of invitational interaction. This theory identifies 4 forms of rhetoric for us: conquest rhetoric, conversion rhetoric, benevolent rhetoric, and invitational rhetoric. Conquest rhetoric is an interaction in which winning is the goal. You want to establish your idea, your claim, your argument as the best one among all competing positions. This is the most prevalent communication form in the US culture. Similarly, conversion rhetoric is designed to change others' perspectives or behaviors based on the superiority or rightness of another position. Religious groups, social movement groups, and advertising campaigns use this type of a rhetoric. The third rhetorical mode is benevolent rhetoric. This one is designed to help others improve their lives. And in the benevolent mode of interaction, information is typically provided to others with the aim of benefiting them in some ways. And the last one is invitational rhetoric. In this type of rhetoric, the goal, as we said before, is the clarification of ideas among participants. You present your idea, but you leave it up to the audience to decide whether to accept your position or not. So a researcher is using invitational rhetoric as a framework for his research, would simply look to see what type of rhetoric is used in a given situation and explore that rhetoric's characteristics.